As people are making their way, I'll just make a few little announcements. So after session 2, if I can have everyone's attention, after session 2 there will be a small break of about 15 minutes just to kind of stretch our legs, use the washroom, get water if you need it, and then we'll immediately be followed by session 3. And then there will be Q&A afterwards. So if you have questions for Presbyter Jeannie, make sure you write them down. We give you guys some nifty notebooks and things like that. So write your questions down so you can ask those. And then following the Q&A session will be the Vespers Service, which will be the end of our program today. So I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that. So if we can have everyone find their seats.
Everybody, thank you for that delicious lunch and for all of your hard work, especially Mary, who's done a lot of work on this retreat. She passed out a little postcard like this that has a website on the front. It is drjeannie.com, my email address. But on the back part where it doesn't have my picture, it has a book. It has Orthodox, it's where you're going to find all of the podcasts, orthodoxbiblestudy.info. It is on ancient faith, but sometimes they're hard to find on ancient faith, partly because they have a lot of podcasts, and also they have the most recent, and they're not grouped together according to subject. This site, orthodoxbiblestudy.info, has everything on one page. And it's easy to find the lessons that you might be interested in. Okay, so we're going to be talking about right now what makes Orthodoxy different than the West. So I was making some rather strong statements earlier, and I know sometimes people feel a little uncomfortable about saying things that the Catholics think like this, or the Protestants do this, or whatever. So my comments are not made because I'm trying to say that we're better than everybody. Our church is better for sure. We as individuals may not be any better than Western Christians, and I'm not suggesting that they have nothing to offer or they can't be saved or anything like this. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm simply trying to draw out distinctions so that we have clarity, so that we understand what Orthodoxy is and how it's different from those other churches. And a lot of people don't think you should ever say anything, even the slightest bit disrespectful. But or I don't think I'm being disrespectful. If I was to go to a Lutheran church, I would expect to hear a Lutheran talk about Lutheranism and what's right with that, and that they're the best. That's what I expect. So we're at an Orthodox church. I'm speaking about the Orthodox faith, and so whether somebody's offended by that, I can't help it. But by the way, when I went with my son to the Vatican. We had a tour of the Vatican Museum and had to hear a lot of things like Peter was the first pope, which isn't true. Peter was never a bishop. He was an apostle. Okay, and things like this. So I kept my mouth shut. I can keep my mouth shut. So I'm respectful of what other people believe, but right now we have to have clarity to distinguish Orthodoxy from the rest, because we're just surrounded by this Western culture, and we have forgotten what it is to think and to be Orthodox Christians. So, how did the West develop differently? It really began with St. Augustine, who was the first person to really very intentionally use human reasoning in theology. He tried, now the reason for that is he tried to follow apostolic tradition, and he did to some extent, but he was not trained in theology or biblical studies. He had difficulty with certain books of the Bible. So instead, he relied on his own philosophical training, and he used human reasoning to answer questions, some of which had already been answered by the church. And he wrote in Latin, and he left a lot of books behind. He wrote many, many books. So his works became the standard works that everyone in the West read because they were in Latin, and the West was reading Latin. What we mean by West is Italy, North Africa, that's places like Algeria, Libya today, Italy, Spain, North Africa, Gaul, and Britain, and sort of what the Frankish kingdom was today, Germany. That's the Latin West. They spoke Latin after the year 200. That was a common language of the West. The East continued to speak Greek. So Augustine influenced a lot of minds because he had this approach of using analysis and human reasoning to answer theological questions. And then everybody in the West became very dependent upon him. He was the leading father of the West. Whereas we had no fathers who ever theologized by using human reasoning and analysis. But even if we did, we have lots of great Greek fathers, St. Athanasius and St. John Chrysostom and Basil the Great and Gregor of Nyssa and Gregor the Theologian, Cyril of Alexandria and Cyril of Jerusalem. There were so many that there was a wide variety of voices all saying the same thing. But here in the West, you had some minor fathers who wrote in Latin also, but the giant, the undisputed giant, was Augustine. So everybody followed not only his teachings, but his theological method, which relied on human reasoning. So it wasn't just the Catholic Church that became dependent and shaped its Phronema by Augustine, but the Protestants as well. And they don't even realize that. What also happened was that the West became, because it started speaking Latin, it became culturally and geographically separated from the East. So the two parts of the church weren't really communicating with each other very well. When the West fell, eventually bishops of Rome began looking to Western Europe for assistance, because the people in the West, even in Rome, even in the year 600 and 700, they still thought of themselves as belonging to the empire in the East, to Constantinople. They would write to the emperor as the subject of the emperor, and they would say, we need military help. We're getting invaded by these people. And so they thought of themselves still as belonging to the Roman Empire, even though they had been conquered. But the Roman Empire in Constantinople, they had their own invasions, the Persians and the Muslims and the Slavs. They couldn't really protect the West. So the West began to look to Western Europe and forging alliances with people like in the Frankish kingdom, like Charlemagne and Pepin before him. So they began to forge these alliances, and so they created a very different culture, a very different way of theologizing in the West. So that's one of the characteristics of the West, is the use of Latin, the use of reason, the use of reliance on St. Augustine, and then increased claims of papal authority. How did this happen? Well, because the popes were all by themselves in the West. The other great leaders of the church were all in the East, and they spoke Greek. And the popes were left to really kind of hold civilization together in Rome. That's a reality. One of the most important popes for developing this theory that the Pope of Rome is the head of the whole church, and that he was made the head of the church by Jesus, based on that passage in Matthew, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. That was Leo the Great. He was the Bishop of Rome around the year 450, and he had to negotiate with Attila the Hun to keep Attila the Hun from slaughtering all the people in Rome. That's really something else. So after the 5th century, when Rome began to suffer all these invasions, the bishops of Rome had to become very strong, and the church took over a lot of the responsibilities that previously had been done by the state, feeding the poor and providing education and clean water and things like this. The church stepped into that void because Roman society and civilization began to deteriorate. So the bishops of Rome became stronger. They really had to be. It's really understandable. But they also began to assert a certain theology. I'm in charge. I'm the head, not only of the Church of the West, but of the whole church around the world. And that was something new. But they justified it using human reasoning. So the characteristics of Western Phronema is this reliance on human reasoning. Now, the average Catholic or Protestant isn't sitting in church thinking legalistically about their piety. There's an underlying tone of legalism and rationalism. And so it's kind of obvious to the Orthodox, but it's very subtle. And the same thing with the Orthodox. You think, well, the Orthodox have rules, and don't they use human reasoning? Not in the same way. The fathers of the church call us the reason-endowed sheep of Christ. So we're not against education. We're not against the use of the intellect or something like that. But as Orthodox Christians, we choose not to follow our own opinions and instead to follow the church. And that can be a challenge because we're all mature. We have capacity to understand a lot of things, to analyze things. We're proficient and experts in our own lives, in our professions. We have a lot of capability to handle our life in every other realm. Why can't we just decide for ourselves what to think and what to believe? In the West, that's not a problem, but that's why they're a mess. But in the Orthodox Church, we take off that hat of independent thinking when we set foot in the church or when we think about the church. You can be an expert. You can be a great aerospace engineer. You can be an attorney, a physician, a teacher, whatever it is. You're going to be using human reasoning, of course, in your job. But when you set foot in the church, you have to say, I am accepting what the church has taught. It doesn't matter whether or not I understand it or can rationally support it. That's the difference between the Orthodox and everyone else. And we have to understand that the way the church operates is not according to human reasoning. The church operates according to the mind of God. And if you really think about it, what the Lord taught did not comport with human reasoning. Most of what the Lord said did not make sense to people in the culture. I'm thinking sometimes about even things that we think that kind of doesn't make sense as we're hearing these parables. There's that parable about the workers. Do you remember this one? There was a man who needed some workers to work in his vineyard. He went out and hired some people at 6 o'clock in the morning. Then he hired more people at 9 o'clock, and then more people at 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock. And the last group he hires at 5 p.m. Everybody worked in the vineyard, but for different amounts of time, and they all got the same pay. 1 denarius. Remember that parable? They said, that's not fair. That's how we would react. But that's the wisdom of God. Okay? So it doesn't matter whether you were a faithful Christian your whole life or you suddenly repent of your sins and accept Christ at the very end of your life, you still get the same reward. That's what the parable is about. It's not about humans and their business operations. It's about God. So we have to remember that there are many things that happen in the church that we don't understand. I'm not talking about people. I'm not talking about bishops or priests because they're human beings. They make mistakes. I'm talking about the teachings of the church, the values, the morals of the church. That has remained constant, and we don't change it for anything, even though it doesn't seem to make sense according to the values or ideas of this world. So, how do we understand this? We have to remember that when it comes to the church, even though we are physically mature, even though you are all experts, very knowledgeable about many things, when it comes to the faith, you are a little child. That's why the priest is called Father. You're supposed to listen to him and take his advice. He is guiding you. The church is like your mother. So the only way I can think about this, or try to explain it, is that if you remember when you were a little kid, some of the ideas you had, some of the schemes you dreamt up in your brain, maybe with your friends or your cousins or your siblings, they all seemed so brilliant. The things you thought were just so wonderful, you had ideas, and they would be disastrous. If you actually tried them, or maybe you tried them and you really fell on your face. Because when you're a child, You don't foresee all the things that can happen. You don't have the wisdom and the foresight and the understanding. You don't have the life history to know what is the right thing to do. But the church is like your mother. So we look at what's happening in our world or in our church, and we say, the church ought to do this. The church ought to change that. Well, the church has been around for a long time. She's like your mother. She has wisdom. She has experience. She knows what works. She knows why things have been done in this way, and we don't. So we have to trust the fact that the Orthodox Church knows what it's doing, and it has that wisdom that we have to appreciate. And it's the kind of wisdom we have. Somebody was talking the other night about his father. Dimitri was telling me about his father and how, his father was just annoying when you're younger. That's how all of us were. Our parents we used to find our parents usually very annoying at a certain age. And then we get older and all of a sudden our parents are so wise and we seek their counsel. Have you ever heard that expression? The older I get, the smarter my parents get. Well, that's the reason. We have to understand that that's the case in the church. We're living in a very narrow window of historical time. And we say, well, why hasn't that changed already? For example, why aren't all the Orthodox one church in America? We have to change that. Well, you know what? There's a reason. And it will happen in its time. But it doesn't have to happen right now because we think it needs to happen right now. Do you understand? There's a way that the church does things. There's a way that the church operates that is very wise, and this is how the church has operated for all these years. And so this is why we do not use human reasoning in theology. It's fallen, it's individualistic, it's fallible, it changes with time and culture. God does not think the way we do. The conclusions of human reasoning differ depending upon the premises that you begin with. Every certain conclusion you come to, every single conclusion you come to from human reasoning begins with certain premises. Well, what if your premise is wrong? Then the conclusion is going to be wrong. But if you think about this also, remember, all sin is based on human reasoning. Okay, anybody who's contemplating committing a sin or a crime, they've reasoned it out, and they've either justified it or they figured out a way that they think they can get away with it. So this is part of the problem of human reasoning. We use it to sin. It's not perfect. And yet in the Catholic Church, they rely on human reasoning. So do Protestants for their theology. They also have a tendency in the Catholic Church toward legalism, toward rules and observations and obligations and things like this. They also rely a lot on documents. There are so many documents that come out from the Vatican, not necessarily from the Pope, but from other Vatican departments. And so Catholics will turn to documents to understand their faith, which is very different from the Orthodox. So what else? So these are the kinds of things that we see in the West. It's very, very different for Orthodox Christians. So Orthodox Christians will see things quite differently because we don't rely on legalism. We don't rely on human rational thinking for our doctrines. Instead, we just stick with what the apostles gave us, what the church has always taught. That's Orthodox. So, I had a colleague at the University of San Diego, and I said, "What are you doing this weekend?" And she said, "I'm going to talk about labor rights, workers," something like this. Because they're very, very into social justice. All of the West is in social justice, the poor, the poor, the poor, the poor, the poor, as if that's practically the gospel. And I would have to remind my students, that's not the gospel. The gospel is about salvation of Jesus Christ, but there's so much emphasis on social justice, they equate it with the gospel. So I'm going to talk about workers. I said, well, how are you going to do that? She says, I'm going to start with Rerum Novarum, which was one of the 1880s papal encyclical about workers or something like this. And then I'm going to talk about Oratorum, and then I'm going to talk about the Bonoborum. And they're all a list of Catholic documents from the Vatican. She's going to walk through the Catholic documents from the 1880s to the present day that talk about labor and workers. That's not how we do things. I'm never going to find, first of all, a document from the Ecumenical Patriarchate about labor relations or something like that. It's not going to happen. But this is what they do. They rely on documents. And the documents all come from Rome. And so they have a very, very narrow focus, and the narrow focus is these are the official documents of the Catholic Church on this subject. And that's what they study. Now, in those documents, they have embedded little brief snippets of quotes from the Bible or quotes from the Fathers. Sometimes it's just a few words. But they use that to justify their position. But it's not the whole quote. It's not the idea that the Father was trying to convey. It's just a little quote to make it look like they're supported and they're following apostolic tradition. Instead, what will the Orthodox do? What would I do if I had to talk about a subject? I would read the Bible, and I would read the earliest fathers that I can find and see what they say about it, and then proceed through the fathers. That's very different from the Orthodox. So what's the difference between Catholic documents from the Vatican and reading the fathers of the Church? The fathers are ancient. Even more recent fathers have the same mentality as the ancient ones. In other words, St. John Chrysostom would have read Origen for sure. And he, even though Origen is not a father for us today, he was an authority at the time. He would have read Irenaeus, and we know he did. It's obvious when you read Chrysostom. And he would have read Justin Martyr. After Chrysostom, Cyril of Alexandria would have read, and Jerome and Augustine were both reading Chrysostom. They were reading Chrysostom. St. Ambrose in Milan was reading Basil the Great. Okay, they were reading each other's works, and they were reading the works of the fathers who came before them. So that means they were constantly going back to the ancient sources. They were being shaped by the mind of the early church. That's the difference. So when we theologize as Orthodox Christians, we are following the ancient mind of the fathers. And the only reason somebody is a father is because he has preserved apostolic tradition. He wouldn't be a father if he hadn't. If he came up with his own ideas, he would not be a father. So the fathers, when we read the fathers, the reason why they're important is because they are expressing the same tradition, the same teachings that the church always has had. So we are always going back to the ancient sources. And that's what shapes our mind as Orthodox Christians. So what are the characteristics of Orthodox Phronema, and why does it matter? Because I'd like to address some modern issues in the culture today and show how the Orthodox handle these things. The first thing that we do is we, of course, preserve apostolic tradition. That is who we are. What is the essence of being a Catholic? The essential thing about being Catholic is that you follow the Pope. That's what makes you a Catholic, a Roman Catholic, or even an Eastern Catholic. You place yourself under the authority of the Pope. That's their thing. That's what they do. I taught at a Catholic university for 20 years, at the Franciscan School of Theology for 9 years. I had lots of Catholic students, lovely Catholic students. A lot of my students were seminarians. They went on to become priests. They love their church. They love their faith. I respect that. They believe in the papacy. I understand that because that's what they have been taught. Generation after generation after generation after generation. It's deeply ingrained in the Catholic mind. The Pope's in charge. That's how it is, and that's how it's always been. But that's not true. The early church didn't have a papacy. They had a bishop in Rome and a bishop in here, a bishop in here. There's a bishop in Ephesus and a bishop in Corinth and a bishop in all these cities. So now the papacy calls itself the Apostolic See, as if it's the only one in the whole world. Well, Jerusalem is Apostolic See, and so is Ephesus and Athens and Corinth. All of them were established by apostles. The East was full of Apostolic Sees. But Rome had succeeded over the centuries in centralizing everything so that everyone in the West came under the umbrella of Rome until the Reformation. Okay, so the difference, of course, is that this became the dominant characteristic of the Latin Church and then now of the Roman Catholic Church, the Catholic Church. You're under the Pope. What is the most essential thing about being a Protestant? What makes you a Protestant? One thing. The Scriptures alone. You believe that the only authority is the Scriptures alone. No church authority or anything else. It's the Scriptures alone. And maybe also you could say you're saved by faith alone. That's what makes you a Protestant. Those are the essential things. That's why they fight so hard. Don't ever expect to convince a Catholic not to believe that the Pope is the head of the church. It's not going to happen. Don't bother. Because that's the essence of what it means to be a Catholic. The same thing with a Protestant. The essence is Scriptures alone and saved by your faith alone. That's it. What about us? Following apostolic tradition unchanged. That's who we are. So, if somebody says, yeah, but we should just change this, you're asking us to change who we are. You wouldn't tell the Catholics to give up the Pope. Why are you telling us to give up apostolic tradition and start ordaining women, whatever it is that they want to do? This is who we are. We preserve apostolic tradition unchanged. And most Orthodox feel very not only attached to that, but personally responsible for it. And this is one of the things I was talking to Presbytera Danielle about. Sometimes if you go to a monastery, there are people who are real sticklers for rules, and they're like, trying to tell you got to cover your head, do this or that, don't do this, don't do that. And they love the rules, and they want to, enforce all the rules. Well, that's really not Orthodox. We're not supposed to just be enforcing rules. That's not what Orthodoxy is. But sometimes they personally feel that that's their responsibility, and that's how they're contributing to preserving the faith. Okay? If you reject something because it was never practiced by the early church, that's to be Orthodox. If you say we should do this even though we never had it before, you're not Orthodox. It doesn't matter whether you were chrismated or you're Orthodox your whole life. If you're advocating something that is not consistent with the teachings of the church, with a continuous practice of the church, you are not Orthodox. Because that's what it is to be an Orthodox Christian. At the heart is that we preserve the church without changing it, regardless of human reasoning, because human reasoning is fallible. It's fallen. They make mistakes, and we're going to talk about this. So, the fathers of the church, the Greek fathers of the church, they were very intelligent. It's not that they were stupid. They didn't know about philosophy. They were trained in Athens, for goodness sake. Gregory, the theologian, and St. Basil went to the greatest school in the world in Athens. Chrysostom was trained by Libanius, the most famous rhetor at the time in Antioch. They knew all of those things. But they chose not to theologize by using human reasoning. You know what St. Gregory said? They called the reasoning of the philosophers Athenian spider webs. Really complicated. Have you ever tried to follow somebody's line of reasoning? It's really complicated. Spider webs. Flimsy and meaningless, and you can tear it to pieces with a wave of your hand. They said, we prefer the philosophy of the fisherman. They didn't care what arguments somebody made for some heretical opinion. It didn't matter. They knew what the church had always taught, and they were going to hold on to that. So that's the characteristic of Orthodoxy. We preserve apostolic tradition. Number 2, we avoid definitions and documents. We accept mystery. We don't try to define or explain things. We don't feel that we have to produce a document from the first century to prove why we should continue in some practice. Well, why are you fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays? There's no proof of that. There's no proof. And I'm going to tell you a couple stories about proof. It doesn't matter. Even if we give proof, it doesn't matter. You're not convincing people because they have this idea in their mind that tradition is wrong and everything that you do has to be documented back to the first century or the second century, okay? We do not feel that. We know that we have preserved apostolic tradition. How do we know that we've preserved apostolic tradition. Why are we so confident? Why are we so confident? And it's amazing that other churches, Bible scholars, they don't think about this at all. I'm going to give you an example of something really stupid that a lot of Bible scholars say, okay? Because I've been in that world. Many Bible scholars believe that St. Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians, but not 2 Thessalonians. Okay, that's kind of the norm. And so they put 2 Thessalonians into a group of Paul's writings called the disputed epistles. Now, they will say things like this. Well, we know that it had to have been written before he died. So 1 Thessalonians was written around the year 51. They say, well, 2 Thessalonians is written by somebody in the name of Paul, in the memory of Paul, not too long after Paul died, maybe 20 years after Paul died. Okay, that's the theory. Now, both of these books are in the New Testament. So when they're coming up with this theory, and they give reasons why they don't think Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians, a lot of people buy those reasons. They're just using their human reasoning. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, yeah, okay, we agree. Paul could not have written 2 Thessalonians, just 1 Thessalonians. So I'm thinking to myself, and I'm laughing to myself at how ridiculous this is. And the reason why they don't realize it's ridiculous is because they don't have the mind of the early church. They're not connected to the early church the way we are. So let me tell you why that is so ridiculous. So they'll give you all these reasons. Boom, 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 boom. This is why 2 Thessalonians is not by Paul. It has to do with the content, okay? Now, so here's why it's ridiculous. Very shortly after St. Paul's death, people began to gather his letters together. He dies as a martyr. He was the spiritual father of people in Corinth and Thessalonica and Ephesus and other places. They gathered his writings together, and they began to copy them as a unit. Now, 2 Thessalonians was never disputed in the early church. Nobody ever said Paul didn't write this. And why not? Just think about this. So here's a question. This is what they don't think about that is so obvious to me. When after Paul's death, were there people alive who still were part of the church of Thessalonica? Of course. Some of them may have known St. Paul as a child, and they lived well past the year 100, and they were part of these people who were collecting the epistles of Paul. Would they know if Paul had written one letter to their church or two? Would they know? Of course they would know. The point is, there's a living community, a congregation that received these letters. And if they knew that he only wrote one, they would say about the second one, oh, that's a forgery. Paul didn't write that. You see what I'm trying to say? It's so obvious. But the only way you can think that somehow the church accepted the second letter is to forget that there's a church there. It's still there. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's still there. There was a continuous tradition, an understanding of what Paul... People knew St. Paul. They knew the letters he wrote. They would have had the originals right there at their church, in the custody of the reader. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? But modernly, a person can hear the reasons why Paul did not write 2 Thessalonians, and they sound so rational, and they're so convincing, until you consider the fact that there was a continuous church there of people who knew Paul, and there is no way that they would have accepted a forgery written in the name of St. Paul. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's so obvious. They don't think like that, okay? Because they're not part of the tradition of the church. Another thing about Orthodoxy is our reliance on the ancient sources, especially the Bible and the Fathers, and this is what gives us this constancy, the authority. So we have Orthodox Christians, Orthodox theologians are supposed to think like the Fathers of the Church, because we're supposed to be reading them and relying on them. So what is the effect of Orthodox Phronema? We have confidence in the church. We trust the church. We say, maybe I don't understand why we do this, but this is what we do, and I will pray to try to understand it. Or I will begin that practice, and then maybe I will come to understand it. We have a unity of faith that no one else has. Don't think that Catholics are united. The Protestants, forget about it. There's 40,000 different Protestant denominations. There are so many, actually, we're not sure, whether it's 20,000 or 40,000 different denominations of Protestants. Catholics look like they're one church, But they're not. Because there's lots of ways to be Catholic. There are 17 different Eastern Catholic churches that come under the Pope, but even among Latin Rite Catholics, did you know there are over 1,000 different orders, different monastic orders and brotherhoods or sisterhoods? So like the Brothers of St. Francis, I taught for the Franciscans. The women's group is the Poor Clares. Okay, their founder was St. Clare. Now, you have the Jesuits and the Dominicans and the Benedictines and all kinds of different, the Sacred Heart, and you have, all these different orders, 1,000 of them. Now, what does this mean about their Phronema? I just want you to think about this. When I was teaching for the Franciscans, I told the students, when you go to confession, all of your sin is not forgiven. They didn't know this. If you go to confession in the Catholic Church, this is part of the official Catholic Catechism, the whole sin is not forgiven. The guilt of the sin is forgiven. They divide the sin into the guilt and the consequence. The guilt is how it takes you away from God. So you're restored. You're reconciled to God. The guilt is forgiven, but not the penal consequence. That's the punishment. That means you still have to be punished for that sin in purgatory. Did you know that? That's official Catholic teaching. So I told this to my students. First, they didn't believe me. So I had to go look it up in the Catholic Catechism, come back next week and say, this is the teaching in the Catholic Catechism. And they said, but we're Franciscans. Okay? What does that mean? You go to Franciscan School of Theology. They teach you the life of St. Francis. You read the writings of St. Francis. You pray the prayers of St. Francis. You adopt the Phronema of St. Francis. But it's the same with St. Benedict and St. Dominic and whoever founded the Sisters of the Sacred Heart and the Sisters of St. Joseph and the Marist Brothers. They all have a different spirituality. They're all shaped according to the mind of their founder. That's 1,000 different brotherhoods and sisterhoods. Just think about that. And that's just in those monastic and those brotherhood and sisterhood orders. They don't have one mind. They're united only because of the papacy. We have multiple heads of our different independent churches. We are united because we have the same Phronema. We accept apostolic tradition, and we don't want to change it. If we change it, what will happen to our church? What will hold us together? There is nothing to hold us together except that unity of the faith that we pray for at every divine liturgy. Praying for the unity of the faith. Dinanotitatis pistios. Remember that? This is what gives us our unity of faith, that we preserve apostolic tradition and we don't change it in favor of Billy Bob's opinion or my ideas or whatever I think is logical or reasonable or how we ought to modernize or do this, that, or the other thing. Do you understand what I'm saying? So Orthodoxy is united from the tradition alone. And so when I mentioned Father Ted is going to retire, it's going to be the same liturgy. It's going to be the same sacraments. It's going to be the same theology, but that's not the case in other churches. Not at all. We have to appreciate what we have and not be willing to just give it up because somebody thinks we ought to do something differently. Because when you do, you open the door to more changes. Well, we changed that. Well, why not do this? We did that. Well, why not have this? So we, Orthodox Christians, do not expect the church to change for us. Instead, we know that the church is the pillar of truth. It's the foundation of everything. And so we are supposed to conform to it, not expect it to change according to us. So I want to apply some of this to some of the modern kind of things that are ideas that people have and try to give you an example of how this works in the real life kind of situation. Let's talk about when we have to work very hard at this, dear people, because I'm trying to skip ahead. Normally I spend 4 hours, so I'm trying to condense this down to 3 hours. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that are happening today. That we have to be very vigilant that we don't allow ourselves to be persuaded to accept things that we know are wrong, but somehow somebody is making this persuasive argument that it should be okay. That's what's happening. And we can become like the pot with a frog in it. We put the frog in cold water in the pot, you put it on the stove, and slowly the frog starts cooking. He doesn't even realize what's happening. That's what's happening in our culture. We're surrounded by all of these immoral ideas, and these things are designed to take us away from the church, and we are just listening to it and kind of absorbing it. We're not even really thinking about it. We're uncritically absorbing these things. We watch stuff on TV we know we shouldn't be watching. We're hearing things we know we shouldn't be hearing. We have to shut our minds to this, because this is how we slowly erode our faith. Let's talk about some of the differences in the reasoning of the churches. Okay, we know how highly we think about the Theotokos. She occupies a prominent place in every Orthodox church. Here on the Constantinou, also in the apse, etc. Now, St. Augustine decided that Adam's sin created a taint on the soul, a disfigurement of the soul that is inherited by everybody, and everybody is responsible for what Adam did. So you're going to pay the price for Adam's sin. That's why you have to be baptized, because you remove the taint on the soul. So this is inherited. So for Catholics, they were very uncomfortable with the idea, because we know that Jesus is a human being too. So they didn't quite know what to do about this fact. How can we say, we've always said in the church that Jesus was sinless. How can Jesus be sinless if he had a human mother? And this bothered them. So they had to say, well, Mary was born without original sin. Well, how could that happen? So they developed this doctrine over a period of time, the Immaculate Conception. Now, sometimes we hear Immaculate Conception, we think it has to do with Christmas and the birth of Jesus. It does not. It has nothing to do with Jesus. We call that the virgin birth. The Immaculate Conception is the conception of Mary by her parents, Joachim and Anna. And it became the doctrine, official dogma of the Catholic Church, that Mary was conceived by her parents without sin, free from sin, preserved immaculately, free from all sin, including original sin. Okay, so they made that an official Catholic doctrine in the 1850s, 1854, I think. And why? Because it's perfectly rational. Because we know Jesus didn't have sin, so obviously he got his human nature from Mary, so she must not have had sin. Therefore, God preserved her free from sin. That makes sense, right? Because he has to be sinless somehow. But what premise did they start with? They started with the premise that original sin, the guilt of Adam, and the taint of the soul is inherited. Okay, so they start with this premise, and they end up with this conclusion of the Immaculate Conception. But they didn't stop there, because one premise, once you accept something is true, you accept the next thing is true also, right? And the next thing that's built on that, and the whole thing is a house of cards. So the next thing was this. Since she had no sin, she was bodily assumed to heaven. We have that as a tradition too, that her body was taken up into heaven. We have this tradition, but there's more. She never died. Now, a lot of Catholics don't know this, but many other Catholics, including theologians, teach that Mary never died. I had a conversation with a very well-known Catholic theologian about this, and I said, but Father, she died. He says, no, she fell asleep. I said, but Father, that's the language the Bible uses, and he knows this. Jesus used, Lazarus has fallen asleep. Paul says, let us not grieve, for those who have fallen asleep. That's the language of the Bible for death. But no. She fell asleep. Why? Because she had no sin. It's logical, isn't it? Okay, so now we have a doctrine. It's not a dogma that she never died, but it's strongly believed by many Catholics, because they talk about the dormition of the Theotokos. She fell asleep. She didn't die. Okay, what's next? Think about this as a perfect person who's not really human and never died. And so John Paul II wanted to proclaim a new Catholic dogma that Mary is co-redemptrix. That means she shares as a redeemer of humankind along with Jesus. He didn't do it. He was very close. But he was stopped because others said, the Orthodox aren't going to like that. They proclaim Mary as co-redeemer. That's a big stretch. And why do they? But they have this idea, it's part of their piety, that because Mary suffered while watching Jesus on the cross, she's suffering there, she shared in his suffering. What saves us? The suffering of Jesus on the cross is what saves us. According to Catholic doctrine, she participated in that, so she also saves us. Well, when we say Mary Theotokos, save us, we don't mean that she's literally our savior. We mean that she's our helper, right? She hears our prayers. That's what we mean. They don't mean that. They mean much more than that. But it's logical. What else? There's a new thing. I don't know if you're ever going to hear about it, but what happens is that there are doctrines that sort of develop out of piety. Now, all of these things are not developed by Catholics because they're doing something wrong. They think that what they're doing is really logical and it's wonderful, and we're affirming Mary and we're blessing Mary and we're upholding Mary. They think it's wonderful. But all of these are developments. Okay, they go built one upon the next upon the next. Here's the next one. They always start in a little circle of people, and then they grow, and they gain a following, and then eventually they become widespread in the Catholic Church. This is how it happens. So one of these minor teachings, which is still held by some people, an Orthodox bishop told me about this, and I looked it up and I found it. There's this idea among some Catholics that when you receive communion, because communion is the body and blood of Christ, you receive Mary too, because she's the one who gave him his humanity. Okay, that's the next thing on the horizon that we're going to see developing. It might take a long time. It might take decades. It might take 100 or 200 years. But I would not be surprised to see that. I'm a little old. I probably won't see it develop into anything. But I have found a papal document about this. Now, here's, again, something very clever. The popes are not going to come out and say it. This document about Mary and communion, they say everything around it. They talk about Mary and communion and she's being the mother of Jesus in the flesh and blood. They say everything but that clear statement. When we receive communion, we get married too. They don't say that because they know it's wrong, but they say everything to encourage the reader to come to that conclusion. See what I mean? That's how it works. And that's how it's planted in the minds of the faithful, and eventually it becomes dogma. This is how it works, and we've seen this again and again and again. Another example of human reasoning. What happened around the year, about 1,000 years ago, is that there was a bishop, who's a saint in the Catholic Church called Anselm of Canterbury. And Anselm of Canterbury asked the question, why did God become man? Why did God become man? He wrote a very famous document called Cur Deus Homo, why God became man. And he said that somebody had to die to pay for our sins. He said sin is like a crime or a crime we commit against God, or a debt we owe to God. And somebody had to die to pay for that. So it couldn't be, God couldn't pay the debt. He's the one that we owe the debt to. But it's such a big debt, human beings couldn't pay it. But only God could, because he was powerful enough. So God had to become a human being, we mean the Son of God, of course, to pay the debt that we owed. So that's perfectly rational. That became the main idea of sin and salvation in the West, and it still is. That Jesus came, suffered on the cross, and died for us. It's perfectly rational, okay? Now, but what if sin is not a crime or a debt for which someone has to pay? We don't have that notion. We don't say, well, listen, Jesus suffered for you. Well, we know that Jesus suffered for us. We understand that. We know that Jesus died for us. We understand that. But not because somebody had to pay a debt that was owed to God. There is a concept in the Catholic Church, it's medieval, but it's still there, called the treasury of merit. It's like a spiritual bank account. And so when Catholics speak about merit, it's very different. Even what they think about saints, it's very different from us. So they will say that you can get merit, that's like bonus points, you get assistance with your spiritual life from Mary, Jesus, and the saints, because they have extra. They have extra grace, so you can borrow from them. And the Pope, of course, is in charge of the treasury of merit. He can dispense the grace that's in the bank account and give you some. Okay? This is still Catholic teaching. It's called an indulgence. And this is one of the things that the Reformers objected to, but it still exists in the Catholic Church. So they might say, this particular year, if you attend this conference or you go to this church, you go to Mass here or you go to confession here, you'll get an indulgence. That means time out of purgatory. Okay? Because no matter how much you confess, you still are going to be punished for your sins in purgatory. You get some time off from purgatory by this indulgence because the Pope is in charge of this spiritual treasury that they call the treasury of merit. I'm not trying to make fun of it. I'm just telling you what they teach. And it's now, a lot of Catholics don't know this, but I've read the official Catholic Catechism. And all this, by the way, it's on the website of the Vatican if you want to look it up. That's where I go, for my information. But it's there, okay? Now, what's wrong with this? Well, this idea that first of all, Anselm of Canterbury said, why did God become man? Because somebody had to pay. This is a problem. It's not even in the Bible. In the Bible it says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. He didn't send him to suffer for us because somebody had to pay. The idea behind sin as a crime means that you have to suffer. You have to suffer punishment. Or a debt, it's like an amount that something you deprived God of. That's actually the teaching of the Catholic Church, that when you sin, you deprive God of his majesty. We don't have anything like that. There's nothing that we do that affects God. Nothing we can do can possibly affect God. So we don't have these ideas. It's a very legalistic notion of salvation. But that's the whole basis for both the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, because the Protestants inherited these ideas from the Catholic Church. It never occurred to them to question it, and it seems perfectly rational. Now, here's one of the consequences of this, again, if you want to treat everything rationally. We would say sin is not a crime or a debt that we owe to God. Sin is spiritual illness. And we come to the Lord for healing. That's why we call him again and again the physician of our souls and bodies. He's not the banker of the treasury of merit. He's the physician of our souls and bodies. That's a very, very different model. And by the way, all the Orthodox know why God became man. It's amazing that Anselm of Canterbury, a bishop, he was the Bishop of Canterbury around the year 1000. He didn't know why God became man. He tried to figure it out, and he came up with this idea. Why did God become man? Athanasius answered, God became man so that, we might become gods. By the way, Athanasius didn't dream that up. He knew that already. Where did he read that? By the way, Irenaeus said something very similar. That's in like the year 180 or 185. Before him, Justin Martyr said something very similar. He's like one of the earliest fathers we have. That's the apostolic tradition. When we talk about why God became man, so that we might become divine, that we might become sanctified, we may become like God, that's apostolic teaching. Only we have that. That's not the Catholic teaching, and that's not Protestant teaching either. And that's the most essential thing, sin and salvation. Can you see how different we are? That gives us a very different idea about salvation, about how we're supposed to live our lives. If the purpose of our life is to become sanctified, to become Christ-like, to imitate God, that's very different than saying, well, that's okay, I don't have to do anything because Jesus paid the debt. Do you see what that does do you see how the Protestant Reformation started and why they feel the way they do? So you see, the Catholic Church said, yes, Jesus died for your sins, but you keep on sinning, so you have to pay in purgatory. And the Protestants came along and said, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. If Jesus died for us and his sacrifice was perfect, then there's nothing we have to do, right? And they're right. There's nothing we can do to add to that. There's nothing we can do to improve on the death of Jesus Christ. So the Protestants, in their own way, are right. We can't save ourselves. We can't contribute it. Do you see how they're locked into this debate? Because the premise is wrong. And the premise is that sin is a debt that we owe to God or a crime for which we must be punished. But what if that's wrong? What if sin is just spiritual illness? It's a straying from God, and all we have to do is come back like the lost sheep. Because that's the imagery that Jesus Christ used, or the physician. That was in the gospel reading today. I've not called the sinners, but the righteous, but the sinners to repentance. I've come not for the healthy, but for the sick. It's Christ who compared himself to a physician, right? You see how closely connected we are to the early church? How the core ideas of sin and salvation are apostolic? And how far they have strayed from that? So we have to be very careful about not incorporating these other ideas into our thought process. I'll give you another example. This will blow your mind. You might see that next spring, because I don't know if this is going to happen, but supposedly Mel Gibson is going to come out with a new movie about the resurrection. It's probably next spring around Easter time, because they know when to release these things to make a lot of money. It's a follow-up to his crucifixion movie. Now, this is a rumor, don't know it for sure, but the idea is that he's going to show Christ's descent to Hades. Something that's in the Bible. We speak about it often in the Orthodox Church. It's a big part of our faith, that he destroyed death. He's standing on the gates of Hades, broken. You see that cross white, looks like a door. He's standing on the gates of Hades, and he's got broken locks under his feet. He emptied Hades of the dead. Hades is not hell. Hades is just the place of the dead. All right. Now, so supposedly Mel Gibson is going to show this, and I don't know how he's going to depict it, but I want to tell you about a particular Catholic theologian and what he said about Christ's descent to Hades. So we would say he went there, and as God, he's wearing white, he's all-powerful, he brought light and life to everyone in Hades and demolished it, and everybody got out of Hades. Not hell, but Hades. Now, there was a Catholic theologian in the 20th century called Hans Urs von Balthasar, who said, remember this premise, Jesus saved us by suffering on the cross. His suffering is what paid the price of our sins. Okay, when we say why Jesus died on the cross, why did Jesus die? Why did Jesus die? To defeat death, trampling down death by death. That's Orthodox. He didn't die to suffer for our sins. He didn't die, in other words, he's not dying because somebody had to pay. He died to defeat death. So von Balthasar said, Jesus suffered in the body on the cross, but that's not enough. His soul didn't suffer. So when he went to Hades, he was tormented by the devil. That's pretty shocking. How could Jesus be tormented by the devil? Okay? But this is logical, because his soul had to suffer too. He had to suffer that sense of alienation from God and all these other things. But it's perfectly rational. Okay. Let's talk about one more, and then I'll let you have your break. Same-sex marriage, because this is a big topic, in our culture. What's wrong with it? Now, I had an experience with some Methodist Christians who recently their church, it was the United Methodist Church, they split because some of them wanted to have same-sex marriage, and so they split. Well, they forced everybody else. Actually, they were the minority, but they forced everybody else out. They pushed through same-sex marriage. So the more conservative Methodists formed their own group. And they invited me to come to this conference they were having. And here is the premise. So listen to this. They said, we want you to come and talk about why human sexuality is dogma in the Orthodox Church. I said, well, it's not dogma in the Orthodox Church. And so he didn't understand what I'm talking about. I didn't understand where he was coming from. So here's what he said. This is the premise. Just listen to this. This is why they're talking about same-sex. If human sexuality is dogma, that means it cannot be changed. But the other Methodists were saying human sexuality is opinion, which means it can be changed. And I said, it's not dogma, but it's not opinion either. It's neither of them. But notice that they begin with this premise, and then they come up with an answer that follows whatever they want to determine is the right answer. So here's what I tried to explain to them, what was wrong with their premise, but they kind of liked it, but they couldn't exactly follow it. If you're using human reasoning to decide this issue, no one is going to be right. There's no clear right or wrong, because the liberal Methodists were saying love is love. Jesus said we shouldn't judge other people. Jesus said love one another. They're in a committed relationship. The church should be welcoming to everyone. When St. Paul wrote this about homosexuality, it was not the word homosexuality. The Bible has been misinterpreted. They give all of these reasons, and they're perfectly logical, right? And then you got the conservative Methodists, and they're saying, but wait a minute, the Bible says this, and Adam and Eve, God made man and woman, and he established marriage between a man and a woman, and their reasoning is perfectly logical, right? Can you see that that's why it's impossible to use human reasoning? What do we say? It's not opinion, but it's not dogma. If you look at it differently, if you say, what is the purpose of human life? That is to achieve sanctification. Then it has nothing to do with that. Then it takes it out of the realm of coming up with some reasons for why something should or should not be done. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? It doesn't matter. The church has always said that, by the way, this is something also different. Homosexual, same-sex attraction itself is not a sin. The attraction alone, the tendency, is not a sin. Just like if you're a heterosexual and you like people of the opposite sex, that is not a sin. It is the lust or the acting on that, even if you're heterosexual with somebody outside of marriage, that is the sin. So a person is not to be shamed for having that attraction. And that's how all this got started. Because this is why we have today gay pride. Why? Because they were shamed. They were told, you're all going to hell. You see, the liberal churches want to affirm the goodness of the human being, and they're right. And we're not in a position to say who's going to heaven, who's going to hell. But that doesn't. But to them, the only alternative was to say it's okay, because they want to affirm the goodness of the human person. The Protestants who are conservative, they also want to affirm the goodness of the human person, but they don't know how. Because they feel like if they do that, then they're saying that the sin is not a sin. And so the best thing that they can do is say what? Hate the sin, love the sinner. Is that Orthodox? No. Why not? But it's Protestant. Why is it not Orthodox? Because the Orthodox, you're not supposed to look at this person and say, you're a sinner, but I love you. The point of the Orthodox Church is everybody's welcome in the church. We're all sinners. Join the club. We're all here fighting over, trying to conquer our own weaknesses. That's what we do here in the church. We can never say, it's okay. You have a problem with your temper? That's okay. You know, you're engaging in same-sex relationships? That's okay. We can't say that. You're eating too much? That's okay. No, it's not. You're proud? You're vain? You're greedy? That's okay. No, we never say that. We don't feel the need to justify the sin to affirm the goodness of the human person. Instead, we say we're all sinners and we're all struggling with our own sins. So the church can do both. Isn't it amazing? That's orthodoxy. That's a very different position than any of the Western churches are taking. So this is why we don't use human reasoning in the church. Because when we do, it's subject to opposite reasons that are just as logical to people, and it's insufficient to explain what the church is all about. And that is to provide a place, a vehicle for the sanctification of the human person. Okay, so let's take a break at this point, and we'll come back at 2:15. Is that our return time? Okay, Father's got thumbs up. Very good. So go ahead, stand up, stretch out, and when we come back, we're gonna talk about how to acquire an Orthodox phronema, and what to do and what to avoid.
Thank you again, Presbytera. Just a quick note, the doors are open if you wanted to use the washrooms in the hall. There are a couple of bathrooms here, but if anyone needs to use washrooms, it's probably better to go that way because there's more people can use it at the same time. So stretch your legs. You got about 10 minutes, and then we'll regroup.
Yes, sir. Will do.